Awesome. All right. Hey, everybody. I am TJ Van Tol. I work as a developer advocate at Blues Wireless, and welcome to React Wednesdays. So, React Wednesdays is a stream we do every Wednesday, as the name sort of implies, where we bring on cool and interesting people from around the React world and have them teach us, show us something new. And I'm going to go ahead and drop a link in the chat. So we have a couple episodes coming up in the next few weeks. And I'll just remind you, telerik.com/React-Wednesdays if you want to learn about upcoming shows, you want calendar invites, those sorts of things as well. All these videos are posted to YouTube. So if you're on YouTube, if you're viewing on YouTube, hi YouTube. So you can also find those links on the website as well if you want to catch these after the fact. But today we have a very fun guest and a very fun topic. We have Adam Bradley. Adam, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
How are you? Awesome. Why don't you tell people who don't know you, who you are, what you do, all those good sorts of things?
Sure, yeah. So quick background is I helped create Ionic Framework back in the day. And also we started working, I built Stencil.js, which is a way to build different library components such as Ionic. And today I'm with Builder.io, working as a director of technology there. And that brings us into what my project is and I'm working on now, which is called Partytown.
Partytown. Well, yeah. Actually, so first of all, you've got a pretty awesome list of tech. I know I've definitely used like pretty much all of those at some point. So first of all, thank you, because a lot of those are like open source, freely available things too, which is kind of fun, kind of slick. But Partytown, man. So my first question, before we get into any technical stuff, you got to explain the name because it is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, awesome. So Partytown, the name actually comes from we're moving third-party scripts into a different location. And as the story goes, I was describing it to Steve, who's the creator of Builder.io, of like what it can do, in the Slack messages. I was saying like, basically you take these third-party scripts, you put them into a different location, it's their own little town, their own little party town. And he immediately said, that's the name, so that's kind of where it came from. So it was a code name for a little while, and it immediately grew as to become the name. So it works out well.
I love this because, well, first of all, maybe you should describe, like, for people that are totally unfamiliar with this, this problem or what you're trying to tackle. Maybe you could just lay it out, like, for a beginner. What is Partytown trying to address? What's the very high level approach it takes?
Yeah, so basically third-party scripts, so things like Google Analytics, HubSpot, Intercom, Amplitude, there's no shortage of different third-party scripts that any website is going to have on them. And normally they're going to have many third-party scripts on it. So if you go to something like CNN.com or any e-commerce site, something like that, and you view the network tab, you're going to see, a megabyte, 4 megabytes, 10 megabytes of different analytics code being downloaded and running on your main thread. And really, there's nothing we can do about that. So like we all spend a lot of time to try to get our web pages fast, try to figure out why Webpack or whatever is bundling too much, too less, or too much, and try to make our site faster. And we put a lot of effort into it. And then all of it looks great, scoring 100s on Lighthouse. And then when you start to add the real world, Google Analytics and things like that, that's when their scripts start to slow everything down. And so that's really what it comes down to, is like, how can we move those scripts, stuff that's normally a megabyte of someone else's code, into a web worker, because really they are kind of asynchronous by nature. Like Google Analytics is a great example of it's listening to events, it's listening to things happening, it's posting slowly to Google, to its servers of like the screen size of this, they click this button. There's lots of like lazy things that are happening. That doesn't need to be on the main thread. And that's really where this call comes down to, is like, legacy analytics all work on the main thread, and that's just how they're built, but they don't need to be there. And so that's what where kind of like the experiment comes from, is like, how could we move them somewhere else?
So what I love about this is a problem that I feel like is as old as the web, because I remember back in the early 2000s when I first started doing like professional web development, this was an issue, right? Like working on a large corporate site. And the thing is too, like, I feel like this is one of the better known web performance practices, right? Like if you look this up, right, Google will tell you like right away, like, hey, try to reduce third-party scripts. But the reality is, if anybody who's worked in these sorts of corporate environments knows, like lots of times the developers aren't the ones making the call here, because I'm sure CNN's developers that have that crazy network tab
Yep.
know that they want to reduce the number of things in that network tab, but they've also got different departments saying like, well, these analytics are important. This sort of tracker thing, like we can't get rid of this. And so as a developer, you're really like crushed inside because you're almost like
So
in
true.
you're like in mitigation mode, right? You're like, okay, we have to do this. It's like, okay, how can we reduce the pain here? Like, and
Right.
there's never really been a good answer. Like we've had like async, you can like mark some of these. Sometimes you can mark these things as like async, which helps a little bit, but kind of not really. So that's why I was first drawn to this, because it's like, oh man, finally somebody's like taking sort of an innovative approach at tackling this problem.
Yeah, and I do want to be super clear up front that this is still alpha. It's still very experimental. So like you can go out and test it out today, but I do not recommend putting it on your homepage in production. So I just want to throw that out really, really fast. But yeah, totally agree. And really, as far as analytics goes, and all the recommendations out there is like, well, don't use third-party scripts. And I totally agree. That's not a practical thing. Like e-commerce companies need that data. They need to gather. They need to have intercom. They need to have HubSpot roll in with their forms and everything. It has to be there for the business. And so that's why I don't want to go the approach of it's like, well, just don't use them because that might be good for your personal blog, but not for companies that need to gather this data to make decisions on.
Yeah, for sure. I am curious though. Like I feel like one of the reasons why people haven't tried more things here is because I am legit, and I've read some of your stuff, like legit confused at how this is even sort of possible, right? Because I think the core challenge here is that a lot of these scripts do crazy things. Like some of them like start writing things to the DOM. They start sending messages.
Oh my God,
yeah, like it's a party town, right? Like there's all sorts of craziness going on. So can you explain like sort of from a technical level, like the approach you take, and if it makes sense to like start showing this too, feel free to go ahead and segue into that.
Yeah, it really comes down to anyone who's wanted to move scripts to web workers since the beginning of web workers, right? Since 10 years ago, it's been practical to be able to do that. The reason why it's not that easy is that it's in a different thread. So when it's in a different thread, that means that it needs to be able to communicate by just posting messages back and forth, which become asynchronous. So no matter what you do, when you send that message, post message as a stringified JSON object, that's going to take a half millisecond for it to happen, which is the problem. So we can build tooling then to communicate between two, and so Comlink is actually a great project there. Comlink is a good project from Google that allows you to move a lot of stuff over to web workers, and they can communicate through Comlink. That's great, but there's still a promise in between the two, or a callback in between two. Yep. And so while a lot of it's technically possible, the real challenge is that all of these third-party analytics, they don't design to being asynchronous, document.title. I like to use document.title as the easiest example because that is a blocking synchronous call. Like when you do document.title, you immediately get the information. It's blocking call, right? It doesn't respond with a promise, and you resolve that promise. And so because all of the analytics are designed that way, you can't just throw it into the web work, because when it tries to do window.screen.inner height, it's not going to be there, right? And then the answer is, well, yeah, you could get it if you had a post message to it, and you could make a proxy to that, things like that. It's like, but still, it's not designed to be. I can't change Google Analytics today and tell them that you needed to run it this way instead. And so that's the huge requirement here, is that to make sure that existing code works exactly how it's meant to work. I can't modify it. I can't change how their functions work, things like that, because it'll blow up then. And so yeah, that was the biggest requirement. And I can kind of go into a little bit of how we're pulling it off so far.
Yeah, feel free to bring that up. And because while you're doing so, I'm just thinking like the most popular third-party scripts that I've used, like they need to use the document or the window, and that's part of the reason why they exist. Like I'm thinking like scripts to make like a commenting thing work. Well, it's going to need the document because it's going to need to like inject its DOM. You think of like some like embedded, like something that creates like embeds for like social or something like that. Same thing. It's going to need to just start tinkering with the DOM, and it needs either the window or the document or both to do some of these things.
Yeah, and usually Google Analytics is the easiest one, I like to think, because it really doesn't do any UI things. But it's surprising how much it actually is referencing the document in window quite a bit. And then this project has taught me so much about what the third-party scripts are doing. And there's a couple of them that are it's just ridiculous of, 3 megabytes of code to build a form. This blows my mind. But that's how it is. And there's nothing we can do about it. It's if you want to use that service, which it's probably you need to, that's what you have to just accept. So over here, we've got, I've got anyone can go to the site, partytown.builder.io. And so this is basically all of my tests that I have of all the different scenarios to make sure that it's working. So the biggest thing is, again, like I can't modify someone else's code. It needs to work exactly how it's supposed to. So basically it needs to replicate the entire DOM, the entire window, like the whole interface of how things happen. And so a good example of that right today would be like JS DOM, where Node.js doesn't have a window and document inside of it. So you bring in Node.js, which works out fine on Node. The problem with that is that that's about 2 megabytes of code. And so if I were to ship, basically a Node.js inside of a web worker, that's 2 megabytes, it kind of defeated the entire purpose of trying to speed up the third-party analytics.
I also feel like the Node.js DOM approach, lots of times that's used to just make sure code doesn't break, or at least some of the situations I've seen it before. So you don't necessarily need it to 100% do its thing right. You more or less just need to like make sure something doesn't, almost like a mock, right? Like, whereas in this, you need it to work and do 100% what it was intending to do.
Yep. And so that was the big trick, is like, I didn't want to go down the path of rewriting my own DOM implementation, because even if I did, it's going to end up being a couple megabytes. Even if it was well written, tiny, small, minified, it's still going to be pretty big because the DOM is huge. And then it would have been outdated tomorrow because something else is going to come out of some new, observe listener or something like that, right? And so I didn't want to chase that. So really the big difference is that the main thread reads all of the different implementations that exist. And it pretty much just tells the web workers like, hey, these are all things that exist, and these things are functions, and these are the different properties that exist on this object. Make these proxies that follow what the main thread follows. And so really it just creates a bunch of interfaces that are just wrappers to proxies, but it has no implementation itself. It just has, it just traps basically. So if I call document.title, that proxy is gonna be like, oh, document.title, that's supposed to be you over here. And all it does is just forward that over to the main thread. And the main thread's like, document title, I know exactly what that is. Responds with the string, sends it back over to the web worker, and gives it to the Google Analytics code of exactly what it was expecting the string. And so really the important part here is that Partytown doesn't want to get involved in any implementation. It doesn't want to make decisions. It doesn't know how set attribute works. It has no clue how set attribute works. It just knows that set attribute is a function and that it's going to return something. And in that case, it's going to return undefined. So it doesn't even care about that. So that's how we're basically able to keep the library about 6 to 8 kilobytes. And that's something that still we're kind of playing around with. But yeah, like that's really, really important to me, is to make sure that it stays tiny and small and fast, because otherwise we just defeated the purpose of trying to download another big library to try to speed up libraries. That just doesn't make sense. So we're happy with right now with about 8 kilobytes to do all of that. And with Atomics, which is kind of the next big thing that I'm hoping to get working, it should shave off another 2 kilobytes from that. So pretty happy with where it's at so far.
So this is interesting. So it's almost like Partytown's kind of like a proxy, right? Am I thinking of that more or less right? Because it's like scanning these other like scripts wherever they come from, and saying like, these are the ones that aren't gonna work, and I need to like do my like web worker magic, more or less, it sounds like.
Yeah, and the big part of it, the real magic, is read main platform. A lot of it is in this function here, where these are like known implementations that I have that the main thread has. And I just know for a fact that we're going to need to know how a text node is created. We need to know what makes up a comment, an element, an SVG things. So those are just known interfaces that I want to emulate. And so I make little fake ones quick. They don't actually do anything. They actually don't even touch the real DOM. I'm using a fake document that's created with the implementation. So it's not even part of your real document yet. And basically, it just loops through all of them and collects up their information. So like what properties are on you and what methods are on your interface. And then in the end, it just sends it all over to the web worker. And then if we go to the web worker side of things, implement this and interfaces. Sorry, I'm trying to remember how this works.
So you're almost building up like your own map of these browser APIs. However, you're not actually building up your own implementations. You just need to know when they're like referenced or used so you can take action.
Yeah, and really the biggest challenge is a method. So like it would be pretty easy to say like any sort of property that gets assigned to this, send it over here, and whatever it does, return the information. So I could send anything and everything over, but I don't know if it's a method or not. And so that was the one gotcha that it needs to make sure is like, oh, if you're calling me and I happen to be a method, then that means I need to actually listen for these arguments and send that over. And so set attribute, get attribute are probably the best examples of that. Get attribute, it can be any number of attributes or arguments. And again, like I really don't know what arguments, if there's 10 of them, if there's none of them, who knows? And I don't even know what it responds with, but I just send all that information over. I call it the real get attribute of that implementation, whether it's, a certain element or something like that. It gets me that information and responds it as a string. And then that's just what the real code gets.
And it sounds like, sorry, I think I'm going to jump you around a little bit, but so I'm guessing in order for this to work, you have to like register the script with Partytown instead of letting the browser hit it first, right? Because if the browser hit it, your proxy has to find it. Well, it has to get registered with the proxy and not with the browser, more or less, so you can do that intermediary work.
Yes, and that's the other big trick. And so the other thing that's important is like, again, there's already established ways to add analytics to your site. Every service, defines like copy and paste this script into your head, or something like that. They all have their own little way of doing it. So I didn't want to go down the path of like, well, you need to install some Webpack loader. You need to have, some sort of form of bundling. You need to configure this, like I didn't want to do all that because while many people are using Webpack and Rollup and something like that, there's many people that are not. So like, WordPress and Jekyll and whatever your site's made out of, it could be anything and everything. And that's why the lowest common denominator is just a script tag. And so that's why all the analytics just use a script tag. So I want to make sure that process was the same too, and not to have a special build script for it. And so the big trick is, and actually this page doesn't have it. Let's go to a simple example, element class. So again, these are actually test pages that I use to run against everything. And I use Microsoft's Playwright, which is like a Chrome's Puppeteer, to run all of these tests. And then I can, verify that this does exactly what it's supposed to do inside of a real browser. So it's kind of crazy. There's, post messages, service workers, HTTP requests, interceptor requests. Let's see what else. You name it, like just about every API we're using. And so to try to write unit tests for this was very, very difficult.
I was going to say, actually, like you really need a real browser environment, right? Because like mocking it would be, it's like almost solving
you wouldn't
another
catch everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I just went straight to using Playwright, which is great. I love Playwright because it actually has testing built right into it, which is awesome. And then it also works in Safari and Firefox and Chrome. And so with those, able to run that all in CI and GitHub Actions and get all the results. And so it works out amazing. So I love it. But here is one of or two examples you can see on my screen. The big thing you notice here is that this is a script tag, but instead of it just saying JavaScript, it says Partytown. And so that does two things. So like the one is that because it's not text/JavaScript or something's there, basically because it's a different type that the browser doesn't understand, the browser's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm not going to do anything. Right. And so this is pretty common for like templates and things like that. But this is just a way to basically make an inert script that's in the DOM. It doesn't actually render any text, but it also doesn't try to execute this script because according to the browser, it has no idea what you're talking about. So that's a good thing. And then the second is that this is also a selector. And so Partytown library on the main thread, when everything's all set up, when your site renders, the first paint happens, when everything is good to go, that's when it's like, okay, why don't I, query selector for all the Partytown scripts and throw them over to the web worker, and they can then kick off what they're supposed to do. So it's basically a way to, the common way is like you should add async or defer to your script tags and have them, happen last. This is like a better way of that, of just saying like, basically it's the same thing, like wait till, window load, or document's ready. And then let's go ahead and grab everything and start executing it onto the web worker. And this is the big trick to do that, and it works out pretty well. And you can see that this script doesn't execute or wouldn't execute because again, the JavaScript's not there.
And presumably you could would it still work if you put a source there, like if this were like something hosted somewhere?
Yes, and so I believe I've got some Google Tag Manager examples. So again, this is like basically an unminified version of the very familiar Google Tag Manager.
Yeah.
Which pretty much just about any site's going to have already added to it, or many sites are going to have this. It's probably most widely used analytics script out there. And so this is the other big trick, is that they're adding a window data layer. And so there's actually a lot of stuff that's happening under the hood to make sure that this does get applied and does work before Partytown kicks in, because there is that big asynchronous problem, and Google Tag Manager is able to do this because they add it as an array to your window immediately. And that's why it works before Google Tag Manager actually kicks in. And we're basically able to do the same thing too. This is a lot of like debugging stuff, so just ignore that. But basically here, this is just a config that says wire this stuff up so that so for the same reason that this works, that we're able to make sure that that works too before everything's loaded. And so like that, I know that question comes up a lot. It's like, well, how would that ever work when something's getting added to window, or any analytics is adding things to that window? And so that's all kind of part of it too. And Google Tag Manager was a great example of getting that to work. And HubSpot and Intercom are also very complicated, but we're getting that to work. And then to answer your question, actually, no, this one doesn't have a script tag. But yeah, you can add the, it could be source, whatever you want. And then also the same thing, the type would have to be text/Partytown. But yeah, it works the same way.
Cool. And it sounds like, so from this example, if I understand your explanation right, if a script is using something on window other than like the standard window, built-in methods, more or less you have to pass some config to Partytown so Partytown knows that also needs to be like proxied, more or less. Is that what that's doing?
Yeah, kind of like the other side of the proxy. So it's like, so like in this case, right, this is what would actually happen without Partytown. It's going to add this data layer object, which is an array to window.
Okay, I think I'm just understanding that, but because you're telling Partytown it can do it first and sort of be the proxy itself, you have to like preempt it more or less.
Yeah, and this is pretty verbose, this code here, and this is actually one of the wrappers that we have built in, so it all become configured already. Like you just, if it's a React component, you just add the Google Tag Manager React component. But he essentially does this, so you don't have to use React for it. Where it adds this little snippet here. This is the code to do that, where basically it creates that array on window, which is this function here that when that gets called, when some event happens before Partytown is ready, it's going to collect them all up just like Google Tag Manager would. And then when Partytown is ready, it's then going to, like anytime an event happens, it's going to forward it on to the web worker. The web worker receives that, and then it does exactly what Google Tag Manager would have done. So like Google Tag Manager, according to its code, sees like, oh, some event happened because you added it to the data layer array. And so that's how that's working.
So I'm curious, this is sort of jumping around as well, but have you done like much in terms of performance testing, like heads up, like how much does this approach save? Like, I'd be curious both like head to head on like, if do you notice a performance diff on Google Tag Manager, and also like larger scale things as well?
Yeah, and so that's kind of the big challenge right now, is to gather that real world data. And so we do have a test going on some of our pages inside of Google, or sorry, builder.io. So we are testing some of that to get real world data, just really to make sure that data is still flowing correctly. And so that's all working. But having just Google Tag Manager makes a difference, but it's not like an amazing difference, right? And so like the big thing is like we want to make sure that we're Intercom, HubSpot, Amplitude, Full Story are just some of the ones that we know are like massive hits to your performance, but you also probably need them.
Yeah.
And so that's like what I've been working on now, is to make sure that we can have some real world examples of taking those off the main thread and speeding them up. So right now I don't have that data. So we, with some of our customers, they're going to let us, or they're going to work with us to start testing this out. So these e-commerce sites, this really matters to them, right? So like they get penalized for SEO, for their page scores and things like that, because they have a lot of analytics, which again is a business requirement. And so we're going to be working with some larger e-commerce sites to actually run these tests on, to make sure that this does make a difference. And that's the stuff I'm really looking forward to. Hoping, fingers crossed, it does make a big difference. All my theories are telling me that it will make a difference. I have been fortunate enough to be able to talk with a lot of the Chrome team about this. They're excited about seeing where this goes. They've been very, very helpful in ideas of how to do this. And so they're just as curious with this. The biggest thing is that, this does speed up your Lighthouse score because we're moving everything off to another thread. We're offloading it, things like that. I was worried that it would be seen as like we're gaming the system, that we tricked Lighthouse today. Oh, I see what you're doing. We better fix that bug and make sure that, we don't. But no, they totally see that this is a valid way. It's doing the right thing. Like you do want to offload a bunch of JavaScript to a different thread. And so they've been very supportive in this and very helpful in helping to come up with ideas of how to do this. But as far as the real world data, that's kind of the next to do, is to get that.
Yeah, and my gut says, and this is just speculation, but things like Google Tag Manager, you probably only notice a small increase because it's Google. They're probably a pretty decent citizen of what they're doing in their approach. To me, like the big bang for your buck is like some shadier, I guess might be one way of phrasing it, third-party scripts that I've for sure had to use that do all sorts of nonsense, because some of those I know. I am curious too if you have any like horror stories of things you've seen some of these scripts do, because I've had like, this is going back a ways, but I've had to work around like document.writes and some of these things before because they would just inject some like help widget that our support team was like convinced that we absolutely needed.
Right.
There's some real, and if you have anything in the chat too, feel free to share your stories as well.
Yeah, and that's actually another part of this that's a lot of fun that I want to start making some clean APIs for, is that because you are in a web worker and because you have to go through our proxies to talk to the main thread, that gives the developers a chance to actually say like, no, you're not allowed to do that. Or you're not allowed to access, navigator.user user agent, or you're not allowed to access, like the developer has full control of what any script can and cannot do. And so like document that right would be the best one. And that might even be a default to just like, you can't do that. I mean, that's like the biggest warning in Lighthouse is like, you shouldn't be using document that right to begin with. And so it's a great way to isolate and sandbox these scripts, to not allow them to do something and not give them access if you don't want to. And yeah, like I've come across quite a few different examples of like basically like a set interval. I'm surprised how much analytics use set interval, like every 50 milliseconds, to scan the entire document, to go through every single element and look for something that changed, but just like constantly. And it's like, are you serious? Like it's no wonder why when you add scripts and like your site turns janky, it's like there's many examples of that happening actually. And that's where like really one of the culprits is both HubSpot and Intercom do a lot of this. But what they're doing really is looking for like size changes or and really the size rarely changes, right? So like if
Yeah.
ever. So they're constantly scanning something, and like if you're doing something, if you make a change to the DOM and then it does another document read 50 milliseconds later, it's it's going to cause a whole page render. So it's really killing performance. But what's happening in the Partytown side of things, and this is what I'm kind of working on right now, is that we know for a fact it didn't change, right? Like we know that that document is the same size, and so if you ask for this again, I'm going to give you the cache size, right? And so it never goes to the DOM. It can do its little, set interval every 50 milliseconds all at once, but it's going to keep getting this cache size of whatever the width was at the last time it was, whatever it was. And then if the width does actually change, then it will, clear out the cache, and the next time it's going to get the new one. But that's like one example of like, fine, spin like crazy in the web worker, but don't touch the main thread, and let your code do, use the main thread as much as possible.
Yeah, and would you let people then, like, I guess, how would you let them configure what they'd want to do in those situations? Would you like let them swap it out with like a no op and say, do anything, or cache it? Because like I could see what's tricky about this is like what we got at earlier. Like if you accept that you have to run this script, you can't change the script, and it's doing one of these things, right? Like sometimes,
yeah. What is it? It expects something in response. Yeah.
Yeah, like it gets into some tricky potential territory.
Yeah, and that's where I haven't finalized the API for this, but right now I'm kind of thinking it like it really would be a very generic thing. Like you could provide really just a hook of like something happened, and then like your hook would receive the options of like, well, it was a method and it was called get attribute, and it was given these arguments. And in most cases you would do nothing and it would just continue to work, but there might be like a very specific one where you want an if statement is like, no, document that right line you are not allowed to do. Let's just return with the empty string, or let's return undefined. Like you could specifically say what the return response would be, and it'd be up to you. And like, I think it needs to stay pretty generic because it could be anything and everything. Like you could have very crazy, very specific if statement, so I don't want to make like this big API that would actually take a lot of code too to write a big API. But to rather like let the developer, basically this is the information, you decide what to do with that information, whether it should go through, whether you should respond with, a very specific data that you want to have. And so really it's just going to be a callback that, developer decides what to do with it.
Yeah, which is what I think I'd want, because I think when I've been in this situation in the past, like as a developer, I kind of know what the problem is. Yeah. Like I've probably debugged it to the point where I know what it is, and I have an idea of what I'd like it to do instead. So I think like as long as the developer has control, I think that makes a lot of sense. And real quick too, I just want to, there's been some questions in chat. So I want to just reset about what we're talking about, because Fool came in and asked about threads in JavaScript. So just to quickly reset for those of you that are just joining us, Adam here is talking to us about Partytown. It's new approach that uses web workers. So that's like the part that's threads in JavaScript. So web workers has been a feature of the browser for quite a while now. I think it's been, I don't even know how many years. I lose track of time, but it essentially allows you to write multi-threaded JavaScript. So its primary intention is like, oh, I have something computationally expensive and I don't want to write this in my main thread. You can spawn off a web worker and do this. And there's ways of communicating between threads in JavaScript. And I think what's interesting about this library is it's trying to use that approach to help wrangle third-party JavaScript so that it keeps the main thread performant for whatever the main thing it is your app is supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I need to reset something here. Get this, of course, during perfect demo as it decided to stop working as we're in the middle of this talk. But what's also cool is like, this is the debug mode. So there's two different, there's the minified version, then there's the very verbose log out anything and everything that's happening version. It's cool to actually see what are all these index doing. So it logs out like it specifically called this property with this value and it returned this value. So you can start to really get insight at every window. And so not just like your main thread, but even all the iframes that are being added to get a lot of insight of like what those analytics are doing.
I actually would find that sort of fascinating, because if you kind of had this, like you could almost build like your own little like like a future version of this, like have your own little like developer toolsy thing for your third party stuff, right? Because you can keep tabs on what these things, since you have this proxy layer, you can sort of keep tabs on what it is you're doing, what sort of effect it's having. I think that's there's a lot of potential for that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also, I just wanted to add that it uses service workers and proxies, which would not be in IE 11. So there is a fallback. Basically, the fallback is just like do what you already have been doing. So like if you don't support navigator.service worker, then these script tags that have text/Partytown, undo them to be text/JavaScript and do what you've always been doing. And so that's the fallback. More testing to make sure that all that stuff is working, but that's kind of where we're at right now. So I know that question comes up too. It's like not everything is going to work, and we're kind of getting, it is 2021. A lot of stuff is supported, but there's always that question that comes up.
Did have Fool is asking a question more about I think just web workers in general. Are there limitations with web workers compared to threads? I'm sort of curious about this too, because I have my experience with web workers is more or less Hello World. I've never had to build anything like serious with it. So I'm curious if has like the web workers spec been sufficient to like meet the needs of what you're trying to do?
Yeah, it has really so there's nothing comes without trade-offs. So the big trade-off is that the script execution itself is actually going to be slower than if it was on the main thread, which you could also see as a feature, right? Because it's a third-party script. You don't really want it to be bothering your main thread. But because it has to talk through this proxy, because it has to go basically hop through two different layers of an asynchronous post message, it's 1 to 2 milliseconds per DOM operation. Now there's a lot of caching that happens because there's like something like a setter. We know that we're not expecting a response because it's going to respond with undefined anyway. So you can basically batch all the setters together, even set attribute, everything can be batched together in one go. And then even there's a lot of caching for dimensions. So like if you do element, inner width or something like that, or just width, it's also going to come back with the height and client height and all the different stuff. So that all happens in one go too. So there's a lot of caching there, but in general, the scripts will execute a little bit slower. And so that's the downside. But again, it's also could be seen as a positive.
I imagine some of this being the web too, there's probably some bit of browser differences between their algorithms for handling that potentially too.
What's cool is because like I'm not implementing the DOM, I'm rather copying whatever the main thread has, or basically just making a copy of proxies onto the web workers, like whatever Safari supports, then the web worker supports, because it really just forwards on everything. It doesn't have an implementation. It just says, what's the one I came across? Window.screen.orientation.
Yeah.
Chrome has that, but Safari doesn't.
Oh, that's funny. You're probably patching bugs for people that forgot to test in Safari, right? Because you'll just copy over a proxy implementation.
Well, it was cool because like my tests were failing in Safari, and like, oh, what did I have wrong? What I broke? And like, oh no, that's correct. It's like it should have done that. It should have like not had orientation inside of Safari and things like that. So that was kind of cool to come across.
Full data as a follow-up in here. So with threads, like, do you have to worry about things like memory barriers, race conditions, deadlocks, like all that sort of complicated stuff or does JavaScript sort of protect you from those sorts of things?
That's let's see, like the biggest challenge. So I'm on refactor like 100 right now because I did come across like deadlock situations, mainly around iframes. Whereas like one iframe was expecting something from its parent iframe, which was expecting something from the main thread, which, like it was able to get into this deadlock situation. With my current refactoring, where basically all the different windows are sharing the same web worker, but they're still kind of in their own little world, I'm able to do the inner window communication without having cause a deadlock. And so since that refactor, I haven't had any issues in that area. And there is a lot of thought that goes into making sure the order of things happen in the exact order they're supposed to, because you can get out of whack. You can have something. There are scenarios where, like, I think it's the CSS insert rule situation. So like a style tag has sheets, and a sheets has CSS rules, and CSS rules has insert rule. And emotion CSS uses that heavily, like a lot. And that was a big performance hit that I came across with Intercom and HubSpot, is because, thousands of these insert rules are being thrown over to the main thread, which was a big performance hit. And so that's where like I started, batching all of them. So when it has, 100 different like rules happening, I batch them all in like one call. Basically, it all happens, which is also better for performance because then it all happens in like one paint on the main thread. But the situation I got into was that one of the services had bad CSS that was actually causing it to throw an error, and they just swallowed the error. They would catch it and do nothing with their bad CSS. But then that thing's out of whack on the main thread. So there is some code in there to make sure to be able to handle that. Like, it is possible things to get out of line. So it is part of the considerations, is that that can happen.
It's funny too, because it's almost like, since you have to replicate the functionality of these things, you almost have to replicate their error functionality too, right? Which is hilarious, but I could see. It's funny. Yeah. And Eli has a good comment in here too. So Eli, hey Eli. But I like this phrase too. Like, since web workers don't access the same memory as the main thread, the communication happens over a bridge. And yeah, so I think like post message, right, just wants like a string for pass. It's basically a bridge with workers. And so I know, like, I've done threads in other languages where like you can share like direct references, and you have to do like locking values and unlocking, and that can get into crazy town, I guess. And
crazy town.
JavaScript has a simpler implementation, I believe, which negates some of those problems.
Yeah, the big thing this is a great question, Eli. Oh, hey, Eli. So the big thing that I try to do with the web worker is that it doesn't want to maintain a memory at all. Like, it kind of wants to be stateless entirely. The only thing that we're doing is that on the main thread, when you access an element's information, we set a symbol to that element of what its an ID is. So every single element that you reference, even the document, the window, they all have a symbol of a certain ID, and that ID is sent over to the web worker. So basically, I can just uniquely identify that element 123. This is its information for the title property and things like that. But it never maintains the state of what the document is, because then they can get out of whack quickly. Because if someone else sets the document title, some other script or your script or something like that set title, like the web worker would be out of sync. It wouldn't know that. And so that's why it's like kind of always, the source of truth is always the main thread. And then they're able to keep like memory of who am I talking to just by the ID that we add to the element. And it's a symbol rather than a attribute, just because I don't want to dirty up the DOM, and touch other people's elements. I just want to be able to uniquely identify but not mess with their attributes and things like that.
Cool. If people have other questions, feel free to type them in. These have been interesting. I think the last couple of things I want to ask you is, so this is an alpha thing right now, right? So what are your plans with this moving forward? And I think also, like, if people are interested in this, like, what would you recommend? Like, sort of, is it worth tinkering? Like, and where should they go to do that sort of thing?
Yeah, so we've got a Discord channel, and that should be all in the README on the repo. So I'd love to get other people's help. And there has been a lot of people helping out, finding issues and things like that. The big one that we want to work on is the atomics. I do think that communicating with atomics is the correct way to do this, whereas the way it's working now is kind of the trick that should work everywhere. And so that's kind of how I see it, is that atomics don't work everywhere yet. They're not available in all the browsers. Hopefully they will be 2 years from now or something like that. We'll see. Safari, I think, has atomics in their tech preview, so it's looking good there. And then the service worker trick is basically going to be the fallback for if you don't support atomics. And so the big goal is to really speed things up. I'm hopeful that atomics are much, much faster at communicating than the current trick. And I label it trick because it really is a lot of black magic of how it communicates.
I'm going to interrupt you just because I need a definition of atomics, and I did drop the Discord link is in the chat for anybody that wants to check that out. And if you're on YouTube, it'll be in the description, which I think is in that direction. But atomics is new to me, so I think I need like the 101 real quick.
Yeah, and it's pretty new to me too, and that's the hard part. So atomics is basically JavaScript or the browser's way to be able to communicate synchronously, be able to share that memory, and send it back and forth. And I can't personally talk too smart about it because I haven't gotten this working yet. So that's what's awesome about OSS is that there's actually been a lot of people that have been working on this, and we have a PR going, and he's been able to help me out to try to get this working. And so the core of Partytown and how the communication works isn't dependent on isn't dependent on the service worker way, but rather we give it a messaging implementation. And so we've got the two different ones. And so like, do you support atomics? Okay, use this version. Do you not? Let's use this service worker version. And so that's where I'm at. So yeah, I myself cannot talk too smart about atomics. It's all new to me too. And I know it was questionable if it was even going to go into browsers because was it one of the security vulnerabilities like 2 years ago? Was it 3 years ago? Was it Spectre? I forget what it's called.
Yeah. I remember it vaguely.
Yeah, and the browsers all removed shared array buffer from being able to work inside the browsers, and so that at that point I didn't think it was going to work at all because I know we wanted to start using that for things like at Ionic. I was hopeful to use that, and even with Stencil.js. But today, I believe Chrome and Firefox have enabled again. It's a tech preview inside of Safari, so I do see that hopefully as like the correct way to do this communication, and we'll get that way working next. And I also, in theory, think it's going to be a lot faster.
Fool is curious. Do you know that whether atomics lets you share objects or like reference values, or is it just really like the primitive types?
I think it's still the primitives, and that's how everything's working now. Because really, what's posting right now is basically JSON back really arrays back and forth, but they're all just primitives inside their strings and numbers. And that's all, on purpose because we can't really pass a class instance or something like that. And so because really it's all going through ACP right now, it really is dumbed down primitives between the two different worlds. And so being able to hook it up to Atomic should be hopefully a lot easier because we're not trying to be too complicated with like these different objects going back and forth. And if you can't tell, I'm not an expert in this. So if you know a lot about this stuff, please jump into Discord and help us build this out because totally think it's possible. And I think it's at the core of the library is ready to accept like to work with the primitives going back and forth.
It sounds like a pretty cool project to get involved with too, because it's solving an interesting problem, right? Some interesting tech. I'm sure you will learn more about browser internals than maybe more than you want to know, but
yeah, right. That's what I think I do see now when you see like any sort of DOM access is slow, right? That's why React is fast and like, all these discussions about like you rarely want to hit the DOM. When you put a 2 millisecond time for every single DOM access, you can see how like, oh, actually that does make a big difference.
Yeah.
It's like you can see immediately it's like you really don't want to touch the DOM as much as possible. You want to do everything in one big go. And again, when every DOM access is 2 milliseconds, you start to see where the bottleneck is.
You made me think of so you told earlier you were telling about the analytics script that did like a set interval, writing constantly checked.
Right.
I remember at a previous job, we had a script that marketing that was actually quite cool. And it would draw a heat map of where people's attention were on the screen, right? So you could tell like if people were thinking about hitting that buy button or whatever, it would show up as red or whatever. And it was actually like really slick to look at. But now like having this conversation in my head, I was thinking like, good God, I never thought of how they'd have to implement that. But the only way they could do it is you'd have a set interval of like every like couple milliseconds, you got to check what the user's doing. You have to take some actions to log that. You have to send that over the network back so that this gets like remembered. And like, it's just like straight up chaos.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. And that's another thing is that all the network requests would happen on the other thread too. So it's not going to interfere with your app. I should also add that most of this is inspired by Worker DOM, which is very similar. So this was a Google AMP project. And Christopher actually helped me out with a lot of the like how this is all going to work. But it's almost kind of like completely opposite goals. Whereas like with worker DOM, you could put the app inside of the worker and then communicate with the DOM. Whereas with Partytown, the opposite is that we want to put your third-party scripts, kind of throw them into the corner and let their main thread be entirely yours. And so like your React app, your Angular app has all the resources available to main, and anyone else that's not part of your app, they're thrown into another corner and they can run a little bit slower. So very similar, but kind of opposite concept and goals of what worker DOM is.
Cool. And I tossed that link in the chat as
Cool.
well if people want to check that out. Well, man, this has been fun. I want to give chat one last call on any questions that came in. And Adam, I'll ask you too, is there anything we missed, like anything interesting about Partytown that you think people should really, really know before we let you go here today?
No, yeah, really. If you have a large e-commerce site or something and you feel the pain of all these third-party scripts that someone has added to your site, we'd love to get your help testing and coming up with like real-world scenarios of just like, this needs to be able to work. Because I actually have gotten a lot of like, feedback of like, this is a hard requirement. This service needs to work, and this service uses like intersection observer, right? We got that all working, and things like that. So if you're in that scenario or just want to help test it out, hop on the Discord channel, which should be in the README, and would love to work with you.
Cool. Well, this has been a lot of fun. We should end up here. Give me like a link dump of anything. Like, where's the best place to follow you? I'll drop off. I'm good at pasting in links, so I'll throw in the Partytown repo here first because that has, I think, most of the links that you'd want people to know about the project.
Yeah, and also just a real quick backstory is like this all got started because I'm working with Mishko Hevery, of the Angular fame on a different framework called Quick. QWIK, and its whole goal is to basically render a landing page or any sort of app without any JavaScript as fast as possible, and then as you use the app, it's going to be pulling in the JavaScript that you do need. And so in all our prototypes, we've been able to make Quick extremely fast because it's really just HTML, CSS, and then it becomes interactive as you need interactivity. But that's where we're like, great, we got 100 scores. This is extremely fast. And then now let's add our analytics to the site. And like, darn it. Right. So like we do all this work to make everything extremely fast. And then once you start adding analytics, there's nothing you can do about it. And so that's really where Partytown came from, is just like, we've got this proof of concept of extremely fast site, but no matter what we do, we get killed by the other stuff. Sure. And so that's where this came from. And so Quick is another project that's still in alpha that we're heavily working on. And that's all going to be, put into builder.io, which is where I work, to help build out these homepages, landing pages to be extremely fast. And so a lot of fun stuff, a lot of work into making sure that these sites stay fast.
That's funny. I'll throw a link to Quick in the chat as well. But I love the origin story of third-party scripts hoped and ruined your dreams. So you had to do something about it.
Yep.
Well, cool, man. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. I think this is a really cool project. So again, like, head to the Partytown README, join the Discord if you're interested in checking this out and helping out. And I'll also remind people, it's React Wednesdays. We do this every Wednesday. I'll drop a link to the show in the chat as well. So if you enjoyed this, feel free to come out, if you're watching this on YouTube, come hang out with us live. You get to ask cool people cool questions. So, who wouldn't want to do that?
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. Have a good one.
Yeah, thanks. You too.